The morning had started like any other during harvest season, the kind of crisp autumn day where the air smelled faintly of dry leaves and the rustling of cornfields carried a steady rhythm like an old lullaby. I had been up since before dawn, the kind of routine that came with farming life, and as the orange glow of the sunrise spread over the horizon, I was already steering my tractor toward the far edge of the field. The corn was high, dry, and ready to come down, and the hum of machinery mixed with the calls of birds overhead. It was peaceful, honest work, the kind that makes a man feel rooted in the soil beneath him. But in the back of my mind, I knew that peace never lasted long here. Not with Karen around. Karen, the self-appointed queen of our HOA, had a way of making everything about her. She was the type who believed the rules bent in her favor but were ironclad for everyone else. She lived 3 houses down from me in one of those oversized suburban homes planted awkwardly next to farmland, and she had been a thorn in my side since the day I moved here. She didn't like the sound of tractors in the morning, didn't like the smell of livestock, didn't like the dust that sometimes drifted across the road when the wind picked up. But the kicker was that she had chosen to live here, in a neighborhood built right on the edge of agricultural land, and somehow she thought her HOA authority stretched into my fields. That morning, as the combine chewed through the rows and the tractor rumbled steadily along, I caught the flash of her silver sedan in the corner of my eye. She came barreling down the narrow gravel road that wound past my property. It wasn't unusual for her to drive too fast, but what happened next was so absurd I had to blink twice to believe it. She swerved. Whether it was impatience, distraction, or her usual sense of entitlement, I couldn't say. But she clipped the side of my tractor with her car. The sound was a horrible screech of metal against metal, sharp enough to slice through the steady drone of harvest equipment. The tractor jolted under me, and my heart lurched into my throat as I gripped the steering wheel, fighting to keep control. Dust billowed up around us, and when I slammed the brakes, the world seemed to freeze in a haze of disbelief. I climbed down, boots crunching against the gravel, my pulse pounding in my ears. Karen was already out of her car, standing with her arms folded like I had done something wrong. Her sedan bore a massive dent in the front fender where it had connected with the heavy steel of my tractor. The tractor itself had a few scratches, but otherwise stood unscathed, its size and strength making her car look like a flimsy toy. "Do you even know what you've done?" I demanded, my voice sharper than I intended, though I doubted politeness would have mattered. Karen huffed, tossing her blonde hair over her shoulder. "You shouldn't even be driving this thing out here. This road is a HOA property, and you farmers are always making a mess. I'll be speaking to the board about this." I couldn't help but laugh, though it wasn't out of humor. "This isn't HOA property, Karen. This is a county road, and I have every right to bring my equipment through here for harvest." Her eyes narrowed, and she jabbed a manicured finger toward me. "You're damaging the community. Look at this road dust everywhere, mud, noise at all hours. And now you've damaged my car." I looked at her car, then back at my tractor, and shook my head. "You hit me. You swerved into me, Karen. There's no question about it." I was driving slow, steady, right where I was supposed to be. She crossed her arms tighter, glaring at me like a schoolteacher scolding a child. "The HOO will have something to say about this. You'll be fined." That's when the anger, long simmering from years of her nonsense, boiled over. "The HOO doesn't own me, Karen. You don't own me. And this isn't your playground where you get to bully people into submission." She rolled her eyes, clearly uninterested in reason. "Well, if you don't admit fault, I'll just call the police myself. Let's see what they have to say about farm machinery blocking the road." "Go ahead," I shot back, pulling my phone from my pocket. "I'll save you the trouble." Her smug expression faltered when I actually dialed. I reported the accident calmly, giving my name, location, and a clear description of what had happened. Within 20 minutes, the flashing lights of a sheriff's cruiser rolled down the gravel road, the sound of the siren cutting briefly through the quiet countryside before it was silenced. The deputy stepped out, a tall man with a steady gaze, his uniform dusted faintly from the gravel kicked up along the way. He walked first to me, then to Karen, and immediately began taking statements. Karen launched into her tirade before he could even ask, her voice shrill and urgent. "Officer, this man was recklessly blocking the road with that monster of a machine. He's destroying the peace of our neighborhood, and he hit my car." The deputy held up a hand, cutting her off with practiced patience. "Ma'am, slow down. One at a time. Sir, what's your account?" I explained it plainly, pointing out the wide scrape across her fender that matched perfectly with the height and position of the tractor. I described my slow pace, the fact that I was fully within my lane, and how she had swerved carelessly. The deputy inspected the vehicles, crouching down, tracing the damage with his fingers. He nodded slightly, then stood and looked Karen squarely in the eye. "Ma'am, from what I can see here, the tractor sustained very little damage, which is consistent with being struck rather than doing the striking. And this is a county road. Farm equipment is allowed. That means you're at fault for this collision." Karen's face turned red, her lips tightening like she'd just bitten into something sour. "That can't be right. You don't understand the kind of problems he causes. He doesn't follow HOA rules. He leaves equipment out. Ma'am," the deputy interrupted, his tone firm now. "HOA rules don't supersede county law. And in this case, your car is not roadworthy. That fender is bent in toward the wheel well, and I can't allow you to drive it safely in this condition." Her jaw dropped. "What? You can't be serious. I'm calling a tow truck," he said, already radioing it in. "Your vehicle is a hazard." I stood there, silent, watching as her carefully built facade of control crumbled piece by piece. The tow truck arrived not long after, its rumble echoing against the quiet fields. Karen protested, argued, even tried to stand in the way, but the deputy calmly guided her aside. The sight of her shiny sedan being hoisted onto the flatbed felt like justice carved into reality. It wasn't about revenge, it was about balance finally tipping in the right direction. After years of her meddling. As the tow truck pulled away, Karen stood on the gravel shoulder, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, glaring daggers in my direction. But for once, she had no power, no rules to twist, no authority to wield. She was just another driver who had broken the law and faced the consequences. The deputy handed me a copy of the report, nodding. "You're good to go, sir." "Sorry for the trouble," I thanked him, tucking the paperwork safely into my pocket. Then I climbed back into my tractor, the engine rumbling to life once more. The corn still stood tall, waiting for me to finish the job, and as I steered back toward the field, a smile tugged at the corner of my lips. For the first time in a long time, I felt like the land itself had stood up with me against the nonsense. Out here, among the rows of golden stalks, the only rules that mattered were the cycles of sun and rain, soil and seed. And no HOA could touch that. The tow truck's taillights disappeared down the gravel road, and I thought maybe, just maybe, the storm had passed. With the sheriff's report in my pocket and the smell of corn dust in the air, I felt like I had finally won a round in the never-ending fight with Karen. But with someone like her, victories were never final. They were only pauses before the next strike. I knew it deep down, the way storm clouds will roll back over the horizon even after the sky clears. That evening, after a long day in the fields, I parked the tractor in the barn and walked back to the farmhouse. The golden light of dusk filtered through the trees, but the calm of it all felt fragile. My wife, Emily, was waiting on the porch with 2 mugs of coffee. She handed me one, her eyes soft with that quiet concern she wore whenever Corinne had been involved. "I heard about what happened," she said, her voice low but steady. "Half the neighborhood's buzzing about it already. They say Corinne was screaming on the side of the road while the cops had her car towed." I sank into the porch chair with a sigh, taking a long sip of the coffee. Yeah, she tried to pin it all on me. Same as always. But this time, the deputy wasn't having it. Emily gave a small smile. About time someone stood up to her. But as night fell and the cicadas droned their chorus, a knot twisted in my stomach. Karen wasn't the type to let things go. And sure enough, the very next morning, I found proof of that dot when I drove the truck down to check the mailbox. There it was, a bright orange slip tucked inside. A violation notice from the HOA. The words were stamped in bold letters, accusing me of improper storage of equipment, obstruction of community roadways, and endangering residents. It was laughable, really, considering everything had happened on a county road, and my tractor was parked neatly in my barn, not a single inch on HOA land. But laughter didn't erase the sting. This was Corinne's move, her counterattack, her way of using the system she controlled to strike back. I crumpled the paper in my hand, muttering under my breath, and marched back inside. Emily took one look at the notice and shook her head. "She filed this last night, didn't she?" "Probably before she even got a ride home." "Looks like it," I muttered, tossing the paper onto the kitchen table. She can't stand losing. If the law won't side with her, she used the HOA to try and grind me down. The days that followed were tense. Karen wasted no time rallying her little circle of allies on the board. I started getting more notices, one about the height of my barn's grass along the road, another about the placement of my mailbox. Even when claiming my rooster was a noise disturbance, it was a flood of petty complaints, each one designed to wear me down, to remind me she still had claws. But something unexpected began happening too. Neighbors who had kept quiet before, who usually nodded politely at meetings and avoided Karen's wrath, started showing up at my door. One evening, just as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with streaks of pink, my neighbor Jim knocked on the door. He was a tall man in his 50s, a carpenter by trade, with calloused hands and a tired smile. "Heard about the accident," he said when I stepped outside. "Corinne's been running her mouth, telling everyone you tried to run her off the road. But folks aren't buying it this time. They saw the tow truck. They saw the police. Some of us are tired of her nonsense." I raised an eyebrow. "You're saying people are ready to stand up to her?" Jim shrugged. "She's made life miserable for too many of us. My wife got fined last year for planting sunflowers too close to the sidewalk. Another neighbor got a violation for leaving a Christmas wreath up until January 3rd. It's gotten out of hand. What happened with you? Well, it's opened some eyes." As he left, I felt something stir inside me. For the first time, I wasn't alone in this fight. Karen's arrogance, her inability to accept fault, had cracked the facade she'd built. Still, Karen wasn't backing down. A week later, the HOA called a special meeting, clearly her doing. The notice claimed it was to address serious community violations, endangering safety and harmony. I knew exactly who they meant. The night of the meeting, the community hall was packed. Folding chairs lined the walls, and neighbors murmured quietly, their eyes flicking between me and Corinne. She sat at the front with her usual air of superiority, a stack of papers in front of her like she was preparing for trial. When the meeting began, she launched straight into her attack. "This board has received multiple complaints about unsafe farming practices, illegal use of community roads, and disregard for HOA guidelines. This behavior is unacceptable and cannot be tolerated." Her voice carried across the room, sharp and commanding, but I noticed something different this time. People weren't nodding along. Some rolled their eyes, others whispered to each other. When my turn came, I stood slowly, my heart pounding, but my voice steady. I wasn't unsafe. I was harvesting on a county road where I have every legal right to be. The police investigated, and Karen was found at fault. Her car was towed because it wasn't safe to drive. This isn't about safety or rules. This is about one person trying to use power to punish anyone who doesn't bend to her will. A murmur rippled through the room. Karen's face flushed red, and she slammed her papers down. That's not true. He's lying to all of you. He's dangerous, a menace. But then Jim stood up from the back. He's right. Karen fined my wife for planting flowers. She fined another family for leaving their garbage cans out a day too long. This isn't about community. It's about control. More voices joined in. A woman near the middle added, "She made me repaint my shutters twice because she didn't like the shade of blue." Someone else said, "She threatened to have my kid's basketball hoop removed." The tide was turning right there in front of me. Karen's eyes darted around the room, her grip on control slipping. She shouted over the growing voices, insisting she was only doing her duty, that without her the community would fall apart. But her words rang hollow by the end of the night. The board voted to table her complaints against me. For the first time, she didn't get her way. She stormed out of the hall, her heels clicking angrily against the tile, leaving behind a room buzzing with relief and whispered conversations about change. When I walked back to my truck, the autumn air felt lighter. The fight wasn't over. I knew Karen would keep coming, keep scheming. But something had shifted. Her power wasn't absolute anymore. Neighbors were waking up, finding their voices, realizing they didn't have to live under her thumb as I drove home. The headlights sweeping across the fields, I thought about the rows of corn waiting for me at dawn. The harvest wasn't just about crops this year. It was about clearing out something rotten, making space for something better to grow. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like the community might actually stand together. The days after the HOA meeting carried a strange mix of relief and unease. For the first time in years, Karen had been shouted down, her authority questioned in front of everyone she lorded over. But people like her didn't fold. They regrouped, plotted, and came back sharper. The quiet that followed felt less like peace and more like the heavy stillness before a storm breaks. Harvest season pressed on, the tractor rolling down long golden rows as the smell of dried stalks and diesel hung in the air. I tried to focus on the work, losing myself in the rhythm of machinery, the turning of soil, the filling of trailers. But every time I glanced toward the road or the neighborhood beyond, I couldn't shake the thought that Karen was watching, planning her next move. I didn't have to wait long to find out. One afternoon, as I was unloading corn into the grain bin, Emily came running from the house with a letter in her hand. The envelope was thick, official-looking, the kind of thing that set your stomach on edge before you even opened it. "It's from a lawyer," she said breathlessly, pressing it into my palm. I tore it open, scanning the bold words at the top. "Cease and desist." The letter claimed I was violating community bylaws, creating noise pollution, and endangering residents with reckless operation of heavy machinery. It threatened fines, liens, even legal action if I didn't cease all disruptive farming activity. Immediately, Emily's face tightened as she watched me read. "She's trying to shut down your harvest. If you stop now, we lose everything." I clenched my jaw, crumpling the letter slightly in my fist. "She doesn't have the authority. Farming rights here go back generations. But she's trying to scare us, make us think she does." Still, the letter had its effect. Word spread quickly, neighbors whispering about lawsuits and liens. Some folks avoided me in the grocery store, afraid of being pulled into the drama. Others stopped by quietly to reassure me, slipping notes of support or shaking my hand firmly as if to say, "Don't back down." Karen, meanwhile, strutted through the neighborhood like she'd already won. I saw her once as I drove past standing at the end of her driveway, sunglasses perched on her nose, talking loudly into her phone as she gestured toward my fields. She wanted to be seen, wanted me to know she was pulling strings. A week later, things got uglier. One morning, as I stepped out to start the tractor, I noticed something off. The fuel cap was missing, and the smell hit me immediately. Diesel everywhere, soaking the dirt beneath the machine. Someone had siphoned the tank dry. My fists clenched, blood pounding hot in my temples. There was no proof, but I didn't need any. Only one person had motive enough to pull a stunt like this. Emily came out, covering her mouth when she saw the mess. "She's not just pushing papers anymore," she whispered. "She's trying to break us." I called the sheriff, filed the report, but without witnesses or cameras. It was just another entry in a growing pile of grievances. The deputy shook his head sympathetically as he scribbled notes. "She's walking a thin line," he said. "But keep documenting everything. Paper trails matter," so that's what I did. Every notice, every letter, every suspicious act, I wrote it down, filed it away. If Corinne wanted a war of attrition, I was ready, but while she fought with threats and sabotage, something else was happening quietly in the background. Neighbors who had spoken up at the meeting began talking more, gathering in small groups at each other's homes. I got calls from people I barely knew, asking about bylaws, about the limits of HOA authority, about their rights. Karen had rolled through fear, but fear was losing its grip. The turning point came one chilly morning when I found a flyer tucked under my truck's windshield wiper. Special election meeting, petition to remove HOA president. My eyebrows shot up, and a slow grin spread across my face. The flyer had no name, no fingerprints, but I knew it wasn't Corinne. This was the community fighting back. When the night of the election came, the hall was more crowded than I'd ever seen it. Folding chairs filled every corner, and people stood along the walls. Corinne sat at the front, stiff and poised, her smile tight and unconvincing. She clearly knew what was coming, but was determined to cling to her throne. The petition was read aloud, detailing years of overreach, arbitrary fines, harassment, and misuse of authority. My name came up too, the tractor incident cited as the final straw that pushed people to act. I sat in the back, silent, listening as neighbor after neighbor took the microphone. "She fined me for my kids. Bikes being left in the driveway," one man said. "She called the cops because my dog barked once," a woman added. "She told me my Christmas lights were too festive," another laughed bitterly. The room buzzed with frustration. Voices rising, the collective weight of years of small tyrannies finally breaking loose. Karen fought back, her voice shrill, insisting she was only protecting property values, preserving order, doing her duty. But no one was buying it anymore. When the votes were counted, the result was undeniable. By a wide margin, the community had chosen to remove her. The announcement was met with applause, relief rolling through the room like a wave. Karen's face was pale, her jaw clenched tight, but she gathered her things and stormed out without a word. For the first time in years, the hall felt lighter. People laughed, clapped each other on the back, even shook my hand as they passed. It wasn't just my victory, it was everyone's. But as I drove home that night, the fields bathed in moonlight, I couldn't shake the unease coiled in my chest. Corinne wasn't the type to disappear quietly. Losing power would only make her more dangerous, more desperate. And sure enough, the next morning, I found proof of it. Spray paint, bright red, scrawled across the side of my barn. "Farmer Menace, get out." I stood there staring at the words, the anger surging through me like wildfire. Emily came out, gasping when she saw it, her hand flying to her mouth. This wasn't just petty fines or legal letters anymore. This was open war. I took a deep breath, steadied myself, and pulled out my phone. The sheriff's office answered on the first ring. "I need to report vandalism," I said, my voice steady despite the fury boiling inside me. And as I hung up, looking at the ugly letters slashed across my barn, I knew part 3 of this battle had just begun. The red spray paint burned against the weathered boards of my barn like a scar, ugly and furious. The words were sloppy, uneven, written in haste, but fueled by venom. "Farmer Menace, get out." For a long moment, I stood rooted to the spot, the cool morning air doing nothing to chill the fire rising in my chest. Emily hovered at my side, her hand light against my arm. "She's lost it," she whispered, her voice a mix of shock and fear. I exhaled slowly, steadying myself. "Yeah, and now she's not hiding anymore." When the deputy arrived, his cruiser crunching over the gravel, he didn't need me to say a word. His eyes swept over the vandalism and he gave a low whistle. "Looks like things escalated, you think?" I said, crossing my arms. "She lost the HOA, so now she's doing this. She's coming at me directly." The deputy scribbled notes, took photos, and assured me the incident would be investigated. But I knew how these things worked. Unless someone saw Karen with a can of paint in her hand, it would be her word against mine. And Karen was slippery. She'd deny, deflect, play the victim like she always did. Sure enough, later that day, as I scrub it at the barn with soap and water, a familiar voice pierced the air. "Vandalism? Really?" I turned to see Karen standing at the edge of my driveway, arms folded, her smirk infuriatingly smug. She wore sunglasses even though the sky was overcast, her posture screaming arrogance. "You think I did this?" she said, her tone dripping with false innocence. "I heard about it from a neighbor. Terrible, just terrible. But you know, when you make enemies, things like this happen." I gripped the scrub brush tighter, my knuckles white. "Cut the act, Karen. Everyone knows it was you." She tilted her head, mock sympathy on her face. "Prove it." Emily stepped forward, her voice sharp. "You need to leave. Right now." Karen laughed, the sound brittle. "Oh, don't worry. I'm not staying. I just wanted to see the mess for myself. Maybe it'll finally teach you that you don't belong here." She turned and walked away, her heels crunching against the gravel, leaving behind the stench of spray paint and the echo of her venom. That night, I lay awake long after Emily had drifted to sleep. The ceiling fan hummed quietly above, but my mind raced. Corinne was unhinged now, stripped of her power but not her obsession. She wouldn't stop until she'd driven us out or destroyed herself trying. The next week proved me right. Strange things started happening around the farm. One morning, I found nails scattered across the driveway, sharp points glinting in the sunlight. Another day, the latch on the chicken coop was undone, the hens wandering loose until I corralled them back. Once, I even caught the faint smell of gasoline near the barn, though nothing had been set alight. It was intimidation, harassment designed to rattle us, and it worked. Emily jumped at every noise outside. I found myself double-checking logs, scanning the tree line whenever I stepped out after dark. Neighbors began to notice too. One evening, Jim stopped by again, his face grim. Corinne's been stirring trouble. Spotted her parked down the road late at night, just sitting there in her car. Folks are nervous. Some are saying we should get a neighborhood watch going. I nodded, exhaustion heavy in my bones. She's not going to stop. Not until someone makes her. The sheriff's office kept coming out, writing reports, but with no hard proof, their hands were tied. Each time, the deputy gave me the same advice. Document everything. Cameras, logs, witnesses. Build your case. So I did. I installed motion lights and cameras around the property, their small red dots blinking in the dark like watchful eyes. I started keeping a journal, logging every incident down to the minute. It wasn't much, but it felt like reclaiming some control, Then came the night when the cameras finally caught her dot. It was around midnight. The farm quiet under a pale moon. Emily and I were asleep when the motion alert buzzed on my phone. I grabbed it grudgingly, blinking at the screen. The camera by the barn showed a figure moving in the shadows. Heart pounding, I sat up, zooming in. There she was, Karen, unmistakable even in the grainy footage, crouched by the barn with a spray can in hand. She shook it, the rattling ball inside loud even through the microphone, and began scrawling another message across the boards. "Emily," I whispered, shaking her awake. "She's here." I'd got her on camera. Within minutes, I was on the phone with the sheriff. This time, when the deputies arrived, I had proof. We watched from the porch as their flashlights cut through the darkness, voices shouting commands. Karen froze like a deer caught in headlights, the spray can still dripping red in her hand. She screamed, cursed, tried to argue, but the deputies cuffed her and led her away. Her voice carried across the night, shrill and desperate. "This isn't over. You can't do this to me. I'll ruin you." Emily clutched my hand, trembling, as the cruiser pulled away. For the first time, real relief washed over me. She couldn't worm her way out of this. Not with video evidence, not with deputies catching her red-handed, but relief was tangled with something else too pity. Watching her dragged off, screaming like a cornered animal, I realized Karen had crossed a line even she couldn't walk back from. Power had been her lifeline, her identity, and now it was gone. What was left was raw desperation. In the days that followed, the community buzzed with the news. Neighbors stopped by, shaking my hand, offering words of support. Some even apologized for staying silent so long. "We should have stood up sooner," one woman said, her eyes downcast. "But you gave us the push we needed." The HOA board announced an emergency session to address Karen's behavior. Rumors swirled of restraining orders, lawsuits, even criminal charges. For once, the weight of justice wasn't leaning in her favor. Still, I couldn't shake the tension coiled in my chest. Even from behind bars, Karen's threats echoed in my ears. "This isn't over." Maybe it wasn't. Maybe she'd find another way to lash out, another scheme to hatch. But for now, with her gone and the farm bathed in the quiet peace of autumn nights, I finally let myself breathe. The harvest went on, the cornfields dwindling row by row until the land lay bare and ready for winter. The air turned sharper, the skies grayer, and no scars lingered, paint still faintly visible on the barn boards. Emily still flinching at sudden noises, we began to heal. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of fire, I sat on the porch with Emily, her head resting on my shoulder. The air smelled of wood smoke and earth, the sounds of crickets filling the silence between us. "You think it's really over?" she asked softly. I stared out at the fields, the horizon stretching endlessly. "I don't know," I admitted. "But whatever comes, we'll face it, together." And for the first time in what felt like forever, I believed it. The following days unfolded like a storm rolling across open farmland, never in a rush but impossible to stop. The story of Karen ramming her shiny car into my tractor during the corn harvest had traveled farther than I ever imagined. Neighbors who rarely poked their heads out came around, asking if the rumors were true, and when I nodded, they chuckled with the kind of satisfaction you only hear when folks think justice is finally catching up with someone who's had it coming for too long. The HOA board, usually tight-lipped and polished, suddenly looked rattled at the next community gathering. I could see it in their stiff shoulders, the way they avoided eye contact, and the unusual lack of gossip at the coffee station. It was as though everyone had silently agreed that Karen had taken things too far this time. Even for her standards, I spent my mornings tending to the damage on my tractor. The bent metal still irritated me every time I laid eyes on it. That machine wasn't just a piece of equipment, it was years of work, sweat, and more than a few late nights fixing it in the barn so it would carry me through another season. Knowing it had been struck by someone's reckless entitlement left a sour taste I couldn't shake. My cousin Luke came by with a welder to help bend the fender back, and while sparks lit up the barn like fireflies, he laughed and said, "Well, at least you've got the whole town behind you now." Corinne's about as popular as a skunk at a picnic. His words made me grin, though deep inside I carried a weight heavier than I cared to admit. Popular support didn't erase the damage, or the fact that someone had endangered my livelihood just to prove a point. Corinne, of course, didn't fade into the background. If anything, she doubled down. I'd catch glimpses of her pacing her driveway on her phone, arms flailing as though she were rehearsing a courtroom drama. She stopped waving at people, stopped making her fake sweet comments about everyone's lawns, and started glaring instead. She even left notes on a couple of neighbors' doors about violations that didn't exist: trash cans being too close to the street, porch lights being left on after midnight. Nobody took her seriously anymore, but that didn't stop her from trying. I knew deep down that people like her didn't just stop. They simmered, plotted, and waited for another chance to stir up trouble. One afternoon, while I was hauling corn into the bins, I noticed a car creeping slowly down the road, almost like it was casing the neighborhood. At first, I thought it was just someone lost, but when it rolled past my farm for the third time in half an hour, my gut told me something was off. Later that evening, a neighbor mentioned Karen had been talking about documenting my property for further HOA complaints. The idea of her snapping photos of my fields made my blood boil. That corn represented months of backbreaking work, and now it was being turned into some twisted weapon in her crusade. I called the police again, not out of spite, but out of principle. Trespassing and harassment aren't part of neighborly life, no matter how much authority someone thinks they have. The officer who showed up knew the situation all too well. He shook his head, muttered Corinne's name under his breath, and promised to have a talk with her. Still, the tension kept climbing. The corn harvest was supposed to be a time of satisfaction, the reward for a season of patience. Instead, I found myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting Corinne to charge into the fields with some new stunt. My mother, wise as she's always been, called one evening and told me, "Don't let her steal your peace. Crops come and go, but your peace of mind is yours to protect." I carried those words like armor, reminding myself that anger might win battles, but calm persistence wins wars. By the end of the week, Crane made her boldest move yet. The HOO had scheduled a special meeting, which sounded harmless enough until I realized it was really about me. The board claimed it was to discuss property usage and neighborhood safety, but the whispers around town revealed the truth. Corinne had pushed for it, insisting I was a menace with dangerous equipment. I walked into that meeting hall with boots still dusted from the field, head held high, and more neighbors behind me than I could count. Karen sat at the front with her arms crossed, jaw tight, and eyes burning holes through me. For once, though, her words didn't land the way she wanted. Every time she tried to paint me as careless, people chimed in with stories of how I'd helped them plowing a driveway in winter, lending tools, or simply being the guy they could count on. The more she ranted, the smaller she looked, until it became almost pitiful. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't raise my voice or throw insults. I simply told the truth about the tractor, about the harvest, about the reckless way she had driven that day. I explained the danger not just to me, but to anyone who might have been in the field. My words weren't flowery, just plain and honest, the way a farmer talks when he's had enough. By the time I finished, the room was quiet, heavy with the realization that this wasn't just petty drama. It was about safety, respect, and responsibility. The board took a vote that night, one Corinne couldn't manipulate. The decision was unanimous. Her complaints were dismissed, her authority stripped back, and she was warned that any further harassment would carry consequences. For the first time in years, Corinne didn't have the upper hand. She stormed out of the hall, muttering under her breath, while the rest of us lingered, sharing relieved smiles and pats on the back. It wasn't victory in the grand sense, but it was enough to remind me that community still meant something. People knew right from wrong, even if it took time for the truth to cut through the noise. As I walked home beneath the stars, boots crunching on gravel, I thought about how strange it all was, how one person's obsession with control could ripple into so many lives, and how resilience could slowly, steadily push back. The fields around me stood tall and golden, ready for the final stretch of harvest, and I realized Corinne's noise had only proven what I already knew. You can't bully the land, you can't bully the seasons, and you sure as hell can't bully someone who's grounded in both. I climbed onto the tractor again the next morning, scars and dents still showing, but its engine roared like defiance, carrying me forward into another day, another fight, and another reminder that no HOA, no Corinne, no entitled tantrum could stop the turning of the earth. The days after the HOA meeting carried a strange sort of quiet, like the hush that settles over a field just before a thunderstorm breaks. On the surface, everything seemed calmer. Neighbors nodded at me in solidarity. The board had officially shut down Corinne's complaints, and for the first time in months, I felt like maybe I could get back to the work that truly mattered. But beneath that quiet ran a current of unease. Corinne wasn't the kind of person to take humiliation gracefully. She was the type who would rather burn down her own house if it meant taking someone else's barn with it. And I could sense, deep in my bones, that she wasn't finished with me yet. Harvest kept me busy from sunup to sundown. The tractor, though still dented from her reckless strike, ran faithfully as I pushed through the last rows of corn. Dust rose behind me in golden clouds, and the bins filled with the promise of winter feed and spring planting money. The work was steadying. It reminded me who I was and what I was fighting for. Each acre finished felt like one more step toward reclaiming normalcy. Yet, even as I drove the tractor down familiar roads, I caught myself glancing toward the road, half expecting Corinne's car to creep along the shoulder or her figure to appear with a phone in hand. Recording. It wasn't paranoia. Word spread quickly that she'd been filing complaints outside the HOA, now letters to the county, calls to zoning officials, even reaching out to insurance adjusters trying to make trouble about the accident. None of it stuck, but each attempt was another thorn. One evening, as I unloaded corn into the bin, Luke pulled up in his old pickup. He leaned against the bed, chewing on a toothpick, and shook his head. "She's drowning, cousin," he said. Folks like that, when they start losing their grip, they thrash around and grab at anything they can. You just hold steady. Don't let her drag you into her mess. I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that her thrashing could still do damage if she struck the wrong place at the wrong time. Then came the letter. Thick, official looking, dropped right in my mailbox with my name printed bold across the front. For a moment, my chest tightened. I half expected some lawsuit or court summons, the kind of thing Corinne would wave around as proof she was winning. But when I slid it open, I found the opposite. It was from the county sheriff's office, informing me that after reviewing the police report, they were moving forward with charges against her reckless endangerment, property damage, and harassment. I read the words twice, maybe 3 times, to let them sink in. Relief mingled with surprise. I hadn't pressed for charges beyond the initial report. I figured it would be another dead end of bureaucracy. Yet here it was, in black and white, accountability knocking on Corinne's door at last out the next morning. 2 sheriff's cruisers pulled into the neighborhood. From my porch, I could see them park in front of her house. Curtains twitched all up and down the street as neighbors peeked out. Karen stormed out onto her porch, her hair in wild disarray, shouting before the deputies even reached her steps. Her words carried through the crisp air claims of conspiracies, persecution, betrayal by the board, betrayal by the town, betrayal even by her own family. None of it mattered. The deputies stood calm, collected, letting her burn herself out before presenting the paperwork. When they escorted her to the car, her shrieks echoing off the siding, I couldn't help but feel a pang of pity. Not because she didn't deserve the consequences she did, but because it was the inevitable end of a road she'd chosen long ago. Still, the neighborhood wasn't free of her shadow. The very next HOA meeting was filled with nervous chatter. Who would take her place on the board? Would her allies try to spin the narrative, claim she'd been unfairly treated? A few attempted weakly to defend her, but the damage had been done. Too many people had seen the tantrums, the notes on doors, the endless harassment. Too many had witnessed her hit my tractor with their own eyes. The board voted to remove her permanently, her seat left empty until someone level-headed could fill it. For the first time in years, people seemed to breathe easier, yet victory didn't feel like a celebration. It felt like a long exhale after holding your breath too long. I went home from that meeting and sat on my porch, watching fireflies blink over the fields. The tractor sat under the barn light, dented but steady, a symbol of endurance. I thought about the months behind me, the tension, the anger, the fear, and I realized how close it had come to swallowing me whole. Karen had been a storm, yes, but she'd also been a lesson. A reminder of how fragile peace can be, and how important it is to stand your ground when someone threatens it. The legal process rolled on slowly. Karen made bail, of course, and for a while she stayed out of sight, licking her wounds. Rumor had it she was spending more time in courtrooms than at home, juggling hearings, fines, and lawyer fees. Her car, what was left of it, had long since been towed, and the gleaming facade of control she once carried was gone. Sometimes I'd catch sight of her trudging to the mailbox, shoulders hunched, a far cry from the woman who used to bark orders across lawns. I never gloated, never jeered, but I won't lie, it felt good to know she couldn't bully the whole town anymore. Neighbors began stopping by more often, not to gossip, but to share pies, lend tools, or just talk about the weather. The ordeal had brought folks closer, united against the tyranny of one person's ego. We laughed more, worked side by side more, and remembered what community was supposed to be. Luke put it best one evening as we sat on the tailgate of his truck, watching the sun dip low. Funny, ain't it? Took a car hitting a tractor to remind people how to be neighbors again. Harvest ended in a blur of long days and tired nights, but it carried a different kind of satisfaction this year. Every bushel of corn I hauled felt like proof that resilience beats chaos, that steady hands outlast flailing ones. Karen's downfall wasn't just about me or my tractor, it was about a whole neighborhood reclaiming its balance. And though the dented metal would always remind me of the fight, it also reminded me of the victory that followed. The final blow came quietly weeks later. A moving truck rumbled into the neighborhood, stopping in front of Corinne's house. Word spread quick. Foreclosure. Legal fees, fines, and mounting debts had tipped her past the point of recovery. She stood on her porch one last time, arms crossed tight, scanning the street as if daring someone to watch her leave. Nobody cheered. Nobody waved. But nobody hid either. We stood tall, calm, collected, watching as the storm finally passed. By sundown, she was gone. I walked back to the barn that evening, laid a hand on the old tractor's hood, and whispered a quiet thanks. Not just for surviving the blow, but for carrying me through it all. The corn bins were full, the air was crisp, and the land was mine to tend without interference. Karen had tried to break that, but in the end, all she managed to do was break herself. Life rolled on, steady as the seasons, And I knew then that no matter what storms might come again, I'd weather them just the same, rooted deep, unshaken, and unafraid. Winter came early that year, the kind of cold that sneaks into your bones, no matter how many layers you wear. The fields that had once stretched golden and tall now lay bare, the last of the corn stubble dusted with frost. Snow drifted down in quiet flurries, covering the dents in the tractor and softening the scars left behind by harvest. Life slowed, as it always did when the land rested, but the silence was different this time. It wasn't weighed down by Corinne's presence, wasn't punctured by her constant complaints or sharp stares. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like it belonged to the people again, not to one woman's obsession with control. Still, I couldn't help but replay everything in my mind. The accident, the shouting, the police car pulling away with her inside, the moving truck that swallowed up her life piece by piece. Those images clung to me like burrs on a flannel shirt, refusing to be brushed off. Corinne was gone, yes, but the echoes of her storm lingered. Part of me wondered if she'd find some way back, some desperate attempt to reclaim the power she'd lost. Another part of me realized it didn't matter whatever road she walked now, it no longer crossed mine. With her house sitting empty, a strange stillness settled over that end of the street. The curtains no longer twitched with judgment, the porch light no longer flickered as a silent threat. For weeks, the place stood like a ghost, windows blank and unwelcoming, until a real estate sign finally went up. I remember the day it was planted in the yard. Neighbors gathered in small knots, whispering about who might buy it. A young family, maybe, or an older couple looking for quiet. Anyone but another Corinne. That was the unspoken prayer hanging in the air. As for me, I poured myself into winter chores. Fixing the fence line, greasing the tractor, stacking firewood high against the barn wall. The rhythm of labor soothed me, each task grounding me further in the land I loved. Some nights I'd sit by the wood stove, listening to the wind howl, and think about how close I'd come to losing it all. One bad accident, one vindictive push, and it could have unraveled my work, my livelihood, maybe even my safety. It made me grateful, not just for survival, but for the community that had rallied when it mattered most. The neighborhood changed in subtle ways after Corinne left. People waved more. Kids played freely in yards without being scolded about noise. Christmas lights went up early that year, strung across porches in bold colors that once would have earned threatening notes about aesthetic uniformity. Laughter carried through the cold air, and for once it wasn't stifled. The absence of her presence was like lifting a heavy stone off everyone's chest. You didn't realize how much you'd been holding your breath until you could finally breathe again. One evening in late December, we gathered for a holiday potluck in the community center, a tradition that had died off years before under Corinne's watchful eye. But now, tables groaned under the weight of casseroles, pies, and steaming trays of food. Children darted between adults, clutching cookies in mittened hands. Old men told stories by the coffee urn, their laughter booming off the walls. I walked in carrying a pumpkin pie my mother had baked, and the applause that met me took me by surprise. It wasn't about the pie, it was about everything else. Neighbors came up one by one, shaking my hand, clapping my back, thanking me not just for standing up to Corinne, but for weathering her storm without giving in to bitterness. It hit me then, in the middle of that crowded room, that the fight had never just been mine. It had belonged to all of us. Corinne had tried to roll with fear and intimidation, but in the end, her downfall had reminded everyone what it meant to be neighbors, to look out for one another, to stand together when it counted. That realization filled me with a quiet pride, one that didn't shout or boast, but settled warm and steady in my chest. The new year came with fresh snow and eventually new neighbors. A young couple with 2 small kids bought Corinne's old house. They arrived in a battered minivan, unloading boxes with tired smiles and hopeful eyes. The day they moved in, half the neighborhood showed up with casseroles, shovels, and warm greetings. I helped carry in furniture, and as we set a couch down in the living room, the wife looked around with relief. "It already feels different here," she said softly. I nodded, knowing exactly what she meant. The shadow was gone, replaced by light and possibility. Life settled into its natural rhythm again. Seasons turned, fields lay dormant, then greened with spring. Calves were born, fences repaired, barns cleaned. The land moved on, as it always does, and so did we. Yet every time I climbed into the tractor, I ran my hand along that dented fender. I never fixed it completely. Some folks asked why, said it would only take a bit more welding to smooth it out. But I left it there, a scar and a reminder. It told the story of resilience, of standing firm when pushed, of a season when truth finally overcame tyranny. It wasn't just a dent, it was proof that I'd endured. Sometimes when I drove past the empty stretch of road where it had all happened, I'd slow down and remember that day, the crunch of metal, the anger in her eyes, the fear that surged through me. And then I'd remember what came after, the support, the justice, the unity. Those memories balanced each other out, shadow and light. They reminded me that even when storms rage, they eventually pass, and what matters is how you hold yourself until the sky's clear. In the end, Karen became a cautionary tale whispered over fences and retold at barbecues. Remember when she hit the tractor? People would say, shaking their heads, half in disbelief, half in relief. Kids who hadn't even been old enough to remember asked about it like it was a legend. And maybe in some strange way it was. Not a story of destruction, but of survival, of community rediscovering itself. I don't know where Karen ended up. Rumors floated. She moved in with a sister. She filed bankruptcy. She tried starting over in another town. Maybe she found a new HOA to torment. Maybe she didn't, but her chapter in our neighborhood was closed, and in its place we wrote something better. As the years rolled on, every harvest brought back the memory. Every time I saw the corn rise high and sway in the breeze, I thought of that day and how it could have gone differently. And every time I whispered the same quiet promise to myself, never let bitterness take root, never let fear win, and never underestimate the strength of a community standing together. Because in the end, that's what the land teaches you. Storms will come, fields will flood, machines will break, people will test you, but if you keep planting, keep tending, keep standing tall, the harvest will always come. And no Karen, no HOA, no wrecked car can stop it. And so life went on. The tractor roared each spring, the fields turned gold each fall, and peace, long fought for, finally took root in the soil of our neighborhood.